Last week we took a look at some core Stoic principles from the ancient world that serve us just as well today, if not better, in dealing with a difficult, chaotic, and sometimes seemingly purposeless world. The Stoic philosophy is more than anything a practical philosophy. And while it is easy for us often to relate to the great big ideas it has, it sometimes seems a little bit tough to put those grand ideas into practice. One of the important things about Stoicism, unlike some other philosophical schools, is that it is very much founded around the idea of practice, practical things you can do to improve your life experience and your outlook on the world. So today I'm going to take a look at some of those core basic practices that we can all try and institute into our lives, that even if we only manage a few of them, will certainly improve our lives and our experience of happiness. Because the Stoics pointed out that in the end, all philosophy is the seeking of happiness, the seeking of contentment, and of course the seeking of how to deal with a very difficult world. Be sure to stay tuned till the end when I'll share with you my favorite quote from the Stoics, which really gets the bottom line of how to live in the world. But let's take a look at some things we can do every day. The most basic piece of advice the Stoics offer really accounts for practically any other advice they could offer, and might be, in many ways, the only thing that we need to do. And that is to pause before we react. You know, we often react out of impulse, out of emotion, often because we're triggered in some kind of a way, and sometimes even because we have a kind of a stock reaction. You know, we're so accustomed to reacting in a particular way to a particular kind of stimulus or a particular kind of trigger that we automatically go into that. And while it might be true that that reaction is just as valid as it ever was, it's not necessarily the case. Because in offering a stock reaction to things, we really are not being thoughtful. We are not being considerate. In other words, we're not considering what it is that our response is about, or what we really feel on this particular occasion about that particular stimulus. So the basic idea is to pause. We would say these days, breathe. It's often a cheesy kind of cliche to say that, but now we mean this in a really practical manner. Take a breath. Give yourself time to consider. Be conscious that you are resisting impulsive reactions and instinctive reactions, and actually take a moment or two to think about what was said on this particular occasion. It's not always easy to jump in before your emotions jump in. But learning to do that sometimes will teach us to do that more and more often. And that alone, as I've said, can be one of the biggest changes we can make. But more fundamentally and more true to what Stoicism is really all about is, with everything that we do and with everything that we react to ask ourselves, how can I use virtue right now? Or perhaps another way of saying that is to say, in the current situation, what is the best I can do? What is the opportunity here to be a better person, to be a better human being? And in every situation, there is such an opportunity to do that, even when that situation is really just going on inside our own minds. From small things, like when you see something that you want, when you see a beautiful cake in the window, is it always appropriate to respond to something that attracts you by moving towards it or taking it or buying it? Is it always appropriate to respond to something that angers you by losing your cool and stamping your feet or saying what you think? It isn't always. So we really have to say to ourselves, what is the virtuous thing to do in terms of the right thing? The Stoics say, let silence be your goal. Only speak if there's really a need for something to say. And that also boils down to the importance of avoiding gossip and avoiding judgment. Two very important Stoic principles. They relate to another one as well, and that is how we judge others versus how we judge ourselves. And in this particular case, I'm thinking of in situations where we judge other people as in need or needing some kind of help or comfort. The Stoics say basically react the same to your own problems as you do to other people's problems. Because very often when we have a problem, when we experience something we don't like, such as loss, we feel sorry for ourselves. We feel the regret and the sadness. We feel powerless and helpless. When we see someone else in that situation, we'll usually try and encourage them. We'll try and get them to see a better perspective of what's happened. We'll try and get them to see a philosophical perspective on something like loss. Always try and get them to see something that will uplift them out of the situation. And yet mysteriously, we don't generally do that for ourselves. We're much more likely to feel pain, sorrow, and of course, self-pity. So sometimes, in a difficult, bad, traumatic, emotional situation, say to yourself, what would I say to someone else experiencing this? We often use the word Stoicism to mean apparently unemotional. And that is not at all what Stoicism really refers to, but rather self-mastery. And mastery of one's own emotions doesn't mean don't have them. It means respond appropriately and perhaps, where possible, in a way that improves your daily experience and your life experience. It's about self-mastery as self-control, not lack of response as self-control. There's also another way that we can deal with difficult input. One of the things earlier I said was learning to not respond to insults and practice restraint. Another way to deal with that is also to learn to respond with humor, not as a way of concealing your reaction, but rather as a way of elevating your own experience of that insult, turning it into something that can inspire you or remind you of where you're trying to go, what you're trying to achieve. There's no harm in responding to an insult with a somewhat cutting remark, but only to make the point that this inspires me further rather than an apology for what I do, or I'll try and hurt you more because you hurt me. So, if someone says something about you that is rather insulting, a good place to start is to say, that's not even the half of it. You should only know what's going on when you don't know. And it disempowers them because they don't expect a friendly reaction and they don't know what to do with a friendly reaction. And it's extremely unlikely that that conversation is going to go down a difficult or negative path. Remember, the most important thing is that you don't want to cloud yourself with those negative emotions. Either way, that person doesn't care, and their insult is really designed to perhaps give them some kind of a better day, if that's what makes them feel better. And that's why you don't want to engage too far with that. You don't want to respond with another insult because you're improving their day, who wanted to get involved in a war of words. Because you're improving their day, they wanted to get involved in a war of words, and you're making your day a little bit more tough because, of course, you wanted peace and harmony like a good Stoic does. So making a joke out of things, not as a way of building too thick a skin that you never deal with anything, but rather just as a way of saying, I've got much more important things to worry about, to talk about. And actually, as I said last week, as a core Stoic principle, other people's opinions don't matter. The reason why other people's opinions don't matter is because they are as equally flawed a human being as you are. So why is their advice so important when they can't live a life any better than you can? They can't achieve any more than you can. They're not honored and recognized and lauded by the world for their great skills in clarity and living. They are just as bad as all of us. So take it with a pinch of salt, because they're no different than you. And that also helps you laugh it off and turn it into a joke, because you realize it's a little bit like, we're both in this together. So you can say that, I'll say something funny, and we'll see who feels better in the end. Mostly, another important Stoic principle is really not to talk about yourself. Why do we talk about yourself? Talking about ourselves is like showing people your holiday photographs when they don't really want to see them. So only talk about yourself where it would contribute to the conversation, and that's not very many places. At the very least, to ask ourselves, why do I actually need to tell them that? Why do I want to say that? Is it because I'm trying to draw attention to myself? Is it because I'm looking for a compliment? And if we're honest with ourselves, we often are looking for a positive feedback of some kind. Something that has been taken to extreme proportions by the importance of likes on social media and the somewhat devastating effect that the roller coaster of likes and not likes has on people's emotional sanity, and as we know, has on young people's emotional development. So the way to avoid all of that is just to not speak of yourself very often, only when it has something to contribute positively to a conversation, perhaps as an example of something or a suggestion of something or a comparison of something, but not a drawing attention because you think it's a great story that they'd all love to hear. Because just like our holiday snaps, you might think it's a great picture, but not everyone does. The great Stoic philosopher and author Seneca tells us that we should be ruthless to the things that don't actually matter. Of course, that also implies we really need to think about what does matter. But he says, how many of us have laid waste to our lives when we weren't aware of what we were losing? We waste time. We waste, he says, how much was wasted on pointless grief, foolish joys, greedy desires, and pointless social amusements. How little of your own life was left to you because so much was engaged in that. Seneca says you will realize you are dying before your time if you waste all that time on petty and trivial things. Seneca's work on the briefness of life is a very important reminder that we don't live very long as it sometimes might seem. That we spend so much of our time doing things we don't need to do, wasteful things, wasted emotions, things for other people that we don't really need to do, following our greed and following our grief and following our desires, and waking up when it's too late. He says you only have one life to live, it's not going to last very long, you don't know when it's going to end, so you may as well do all the important, right kind of things right now. Another extremely important contribution by Seneca in terms of practice as a Stoic is to clarify your intentions. Be very clear on directing your efforts to something in particular. Then he says, keep that something in view and plan accordingly so that in the end you're not completely overwhelmed by circumstances and you'll know when to stop. If you don't have any direction, you don't know what to do and you don't know when to stop. He says, when you do have a direction, when you do have a goal, you'll know when you get there or you'll know when you didn't. If you don't have a goal at all, you'll never know when you got there, and you'll never get that sense of the correct achievement. As he says, having an end in mind is no guarantee that you'll reach it. We can't pretend that. But not having an end in mind is a definite guarantee that you won't. You know, the Stoics actually believe that a lot of the dysfunction of life and our experience of life and a lot of the chaos of life was because we so often act purposelessly. And if we're all acting purposelessly, it's like random balls bouncing around and like hoping there's going to be a lottery number that comes out of that. So we need to act purposefully. It doesn't mean you have to know your bigger purpose in life. And remember, it's not about actually achieving the purpose. That may or may not happen. That isn't the point. But when we've focused towards the purpose, we know when we've had enough. We know when we've reached the goal. We know when we're off track. If we don't define the goal, we know none of that, and we make it far more chaotic because it always feels like we're trying to get there, we don't know where there is, and therefore we never know whether we got there or not. The most basic piece of advice the Stoics offer really accounts for practically any other advice they could offer, and might be, in many ways, the only thing that we need to do. And that is to pause before we react. You know, we often react out of impulse, out of emotion, often because we're triggered in some kind of a way, and sometimes even because we have a kind of a stock reaction. You know, we're so accustomed to reacting in a particular way to a particular kind of stimulus or a particular kind of trigger that we automatically go into that. And while it might be true that that reaction is just as valid as it ever was, it's not necessarily the case. Because in offering a stock reaction to things, we really are not being thoughtful. We are not being considerate. In other words, we're not considering what it is that our response is about or what we really feel on this particular occasion about that particular stimulus. So the basic idea is to pause. We would say these days, breathe. It's often a cheesy kind of cliche to say that, but now we mean this in a really practical manner. Take a breath. Give yourself time to consider. Be conscious that you are resisting impulsive reactions and instinctive reactions, and actually take a moment or two to think about what was said on this particular occasion. It's not always easy to jump in before your emotions jump in, but learning to do that sometimes will teach us to do that more and more often. And that alone, as I've said, can be one of the biggest changes we can make. But more fundamentally and more true to what Stoicism is really all about is, with everything that we do and with everything that we react to ask ourselves, how can I use virtue right now? Or perhaps another way of saying that is to say, in the current situation, what is the best I can do? What is the opportunity here to be a better person, to be a better human being? In every situation, there is such an opportunity to do that, even when that situation is really just going on inside our own minds. From small things, like when you see something that you want, when you see a beautiful cake in the window, to learn that this is a moment where I experience restraint. When you don't buy the cupcake, this isn't about don't buy cupcakes. It's really just about taking charge of doing the right thing at the right time, doing the right thing for yourself, and where appropriate, it's doing the right thing for others. Perhaps sometimes, when taking that breath to pause and consider our reactions, we can also ask ourselves, what is the right thing for me and for that person? And of course, especially for me. not in any selfish sense, but in the sense that I've got to survive this day until the end. Is it always appropriate to act with, is it always appropriate to respond to something that attracts you by moving towards it or taking it or buying it? Is it always appropriate to respond to something that angers you by losing your cool and stamping your feet or saying what you think? It isn't always. So we really have to say to ourselves, what is the virtuous thing to do in terms of the right thing? And as you do that, you will discover more restraint and you will discover more patience, especially learning to be circumspect in your response to things which make you impatient. Because learning patience is one of those things that serves you in practically everything else, just like learning to pause and keep silent when appropriate. That kind of wisdom eventually teaches us tolerance, and we learn to tolerate what's going on around us while everyone fights their own battles with how to be a human being in the world. One of the best ways to improve our experience of our everyday lives is to attempt to bring our own will into harmony with whatever is happening around us. Epictetus points out that if you make the effort to bring your will into harmony with everything around you, then the experience is that nothing ever happens that is against your wishes or against your will. It seems like a little trick, but of course the hidden exercise in there is learning to accept what you're not in control of and harmonizing yourself instead where you are in control, that is with your own reactions to things. You know, there's a lot that we have to do. There's a lot that we have to struggle with in our lives and in our efforts to be a good Stoic or to be happy in that way. One of the most important things that the Stoics suggested is to keep a journal and to reflect on our day. Every day, to look back on what happened that day, to consider everything you did that day, and to ask yourself the value, the ethical value of what you did. Ask yourself, did I perhaps act wrongly over there? Or did I leave something undone over there? Seneca says you should ask yourself, what habit have I cured today? What vice or desire have I checked? And to ask yourself, in what respect am I better today? And he says by asking yourself that question is how you will become better every day. In looking back on the day is a very, very powerful thing. But then in the end he says, in the end you need to pardon yourself for what you have done today that didn't meet the standards, your standards of ethics or managing yourself in a controlled fashion. And pardon yourself and tell yourself that you will do better tomorrow. That good old-fashioned advice is necessary despite one of the most important and very first things that our great teacher, Stoic, Marcus Aurelius, has to say for us. If we only listen to Marcus on this, we almost wouldn't need to worry about all the rest. He says, say to yourself first thing in the morning, today I shall meet people who are meddling, ungrateful, aggressive, treacherous, malicious, and antisocial. All this has afflicted them through their ignorance of true good and evil. But I have seen the nature of good is what is right, and the nature of evil is what is wrong. And I have reflected that the nature of the offender himself is actually akin to my own. Not a kinship of blood, but a sharing in the same mind, the same fragment of divinity. Therefore, I cannot be harmed by any of them, as none can infect me with their wrong, and nor can I be angry with my kinsman or hate him. We were born for cooperation, like feet, like hands, like eyelids, like the rows of upper and lower teeth. So, to work in opposition to one another is against nature, and anger or rejection is working in opposition. Next week, spring finally arrives with the equinox, and I'll be looking at the month ahead. See you then.